We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Charles Henderson. I'm one of the summer interns here, so if I mess anything up, please be kind. But before I introduce our guest speaker, the Institute of World Politics is a graduate school of national security and international affairs dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of the international realities and the ethical conduct of statecraft, based on the knowledge and appreciation of the founding principles of the American political economy and the Western moral traditions. This lecture is sponsored by the Costa, Chair of Polish Studies, and the Center of Interim Studies. So our guest, Brandon Weichert, is a former congressional staffer and the founder of the Weichert Report. His book on national security space policy will be releasing shortly.
Later this year, yeah.
Later this year. Brandon holds a BA in political science from DePaul University and is an associate member of the new college at Oxford University. Recently, Brandon obtained his master's in statecraft and national security affairs here at the Institute of World Politics with a specialization in defense policy. On top of being a contributor to conservative publication, American Greatness, Brandon does speaking engagements, presents papers, and conducts media interviews. He has been featured in BBC World News, World Update with Dan Damon. He has been interviewed by the Christian Science Monitor. He has appeared in the Dino Report with Dino Costa, and he has been featured on the Seth Chris Show, offering his expertise as a national security and foreign policy specialist. Without further ado, here's Brandon.
How's everybody doing? Thanks for coming out today. Today we're trying to figure out the question that has been posed a lot recently, which is, what is the French role in the Russo-German alliance? And we're going to start here. To understand what's going on in European, specifically French politics today, you have to look back to 1815, which was when Napoleon was defeated. French military power was in the decline, and their longtime old rival, the British Empire, was ascendant with a major monopoly of naval power. And then also, of course, more troublingly for the French, the rise of a unified, powerful German state next door. These two factors, more than anything, started to shift the way that the French viewed their foreign policy and national security. Within a few decades after the loss of Napoleon, the Franco-Prussian War erupted between the Prussians and the French, and the Prussians, which were basically the leaders, the warrior caste of the German states, the Prussians crushed the French in about a year. From that point onward, the French began looking at a way to contain the rising industrial might of Germany. So they made a deal with the British, which was to basically rely on British naval power as a deterrence against Germany really pushing for war. The British could blockade German ports, and then at the same time, the French pivoted and made an alliance with the Russians, which were a large land army, land force. So those two, that agreement they thought would protect them. It would create a balance of power scenario in Europe. And the deal with Russia lasted from the 1890s until 1912. It should be noted, though, that going back to the 1870s, the French had been looking for ways to align closer with Russia as a means to force Germany to not be so militant, because the French were the #1 targets of Germany. And so they were trying to figure out a way to, with a reduced military power after the Napoleonic Wars, trying to figure out a way to complicate the Germans' threat to France. Another important aspect that informs French policies today is the two world wars. In the French were, yet again, their fears of Germany were realized when the Germans decided in both world wars at the start to focus almost exclusively on fighting the French and trying to take them out. Now, in the First World War, it was the Miracle on the Marne, the First Battle of the Marne. The French were able to hold on and prevent the German advance at great cost. And of course, the introduction of American forces in World War I was instrumental from preventing France from being conquered. The Russians, their allies, collapsed during that war, of course, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was aided in large part by the German intelligence services. They funded Lenin's expedition, they pulled him out from exile, and they put him into Russia to do his dastardly deeds. In World War II, there was no Miracle on the Marne, and the Germans conquered France in short order. If it was not for the Anglo-American force liberating France, who knows what would have happened in terms of how long the occupation could have gone on. When they came out of the war, the French Empire, such as it was hanging on by a thread, but decolonization would pretty much put an end to the French Empire as we understand it in terms of colonial holdings. Indochina would be lost, Algeria, elsewhere. It's important to note something about the Allied, the Allied disconnect, the dissonance between the Allies in the interwar years, between World War I and II. France, yet again, in between the wars, was trying to create a new balance of power paradigm that would keep what they believed a resurgent Germany at bay. They believed that the Germans, and they were right, the Germans were not living up to the Armistice Treaty, that they were looking for ways constantly to undermine it, that their disarmament was actually not what they were saying it was. The British were skeptical, the Americans really didn't care. The Russians were dealing with the fallout from the Bolshevik Revolution, and of course ultimately the Russians would briefly align with the Germans during the interwar period with the Treaty of Rapallo. So the French were trying to figure out a way with their reduced power, with their reduced demographic strength, they were trying to figure out a way they can prevent Germany from rising again to challenge them. Balance of power. Unfortunately, though, the British actually, every time the French would start agitating for greater military commitments from against Germany, the British were not listening, and they thought actually the French were trying to become revanchists and not the Germans. So this ultimately ended in the Treaty of Locarno because the French wanted to use the newly established Polish corridor, what we refer to here as the Intermarium states, to the east of Germany to balance against a rising Germany. At the same time, France wanted to balance against Germany west of the Rhine. They needed British military guarantees. The British haphazardly gave it, and ultimately the Treaty of Locarno was not what didn't help to prevent rising Germany. At its heart, after the Second World War, after decolonization, France was a spent force. They were trying to figure out a way they can still be powerful, have the influence that they once had before losing so much. And Charles de Gaulle arose to power. He basically created the modern French state. He was the first president of France after the war ended. And he was trying to figure out his foreign policy, his national policies were all about the politics of Europe. And answering the question, how does France end the violent cycle of competition that has dominated Europe since 1871 with the reduced capabilities that France had at that point? Today's Europe, much like then, is governed, I think, closely to this quote by John Holzman in 2003. The continental Europe of today remains divided into Gaullist and Atlanticist camps, a Europe of many voices where the nation-state is again seen as the primary unit of foreign policy decision-making will best suit American interests well into the future. This was during the Iraq War imbroglio when we were having problems with France diplomatically. That's an interesting thing to hang on to. Please remember that quote because we will be getting back to that. But in terms of de Gaulle, he crafted a program, Gaullism is what it became known as, and it was basically an assertion of France's right to be a major independent state and have a major independent role in not just European politics, but international relations, all international politics as well. In the domestic side, it wanted a very large outsized role for the central government in French economics. It was Keynesian, and it was staunchly anti-communist. It's important to note that the France of today, like much of the democracies around the world, is a social democracy, so it automatically favors greater centralization of power with the government in Paris, as well as a greater role of government action in the private sector. Going off of this notion of French independence, even though they were completely depleted and laid low by the world wars and the Franco-Prussian War before that, and of course the Napoleonic Wars before that, the de Gaulle came up with the concept for force de frappe. And no, this is not a new Starbucks drink. Means an independent nuclear strike force, and de Gaulle was not only more right-leaning, not more of a nationalist, French nationalist, he was also someone who disbelieved the American security guarantees. Going into the Cold War, after the world wars ended, the Soviet Union was a threat to Europe. America, as some of you may know, created NATO. We fostered European integration as a means of countering the Soviet revanchism, and we also guaranteed the independence of Western Europe with our own nuclear deterrent. We extended our nuclear umbrella over Europe. De Gaulle did not believe this. He thought that this was only worth what it was written on paper. He didn't think that we would actually follow through. In fact, he wasn't alone. The British also thought this as well. This is one of the reasons why the British ultimately ended up developing their own nuclear arsenal. What de Gaulle wanted to do was to create a small arsenal. He didn't believe it could be something big the way that the Americans and Russians had it, but he wanted to have enough of potency to tear an arm off of the Soviets if they ever attacked. And the logic of the engagement was it would deter the Soviets if they ever invaded Western Germany. It would deter them from going beyond the Rhine because they wouldn't want to risk their forces. Now, knowing Soviet military doctrine as I do, I'm not sure that 10, 20, or even 100 nukes at France's disposal would have really deterred the Soviets in the event of all-out war, but de Gaulle figured he'd give it the old college try. As I say, it was distrustful of America's commitment to France. And also we have to remember, de Gaulle was a man who came up in the last phases of the French patriotism, the France being great, and he witnessed the depletion of France in the world wars, and he was looking for a means to maintain French power away from having to become what he worried would be a vassal state of the U.S. And obviously he being an anti-communist did absolutely not want to have to risk Soviet occupation of France the way that they split Germany and Eastern Europe away. And just a joke there. The conflict for de Gaulle, and indeed the conflict for Europe and France today, is what de Gaulle dubbed the crisis of mixed sovereignty versus French European hegemony, or at least French military supremacy on the continent. De Gaulle jealously guarded French sovereignty, and he would get involved with, like he was a classic practitioner of realpolitik, he would get involved with alliances, but he had reservations, and there were a series of caveats, and he was going to do ultimately what was in France's interests, not in the perceived shared interests of Europe. Of course, at this point in time, European integration was still just getting started. And he worried, and I think rightly so, that the only way that he could achieve his other goal of having this dominant, outsized position, role in European and international affairs was through multilateral organizations in Europe, with France being the most dominant one there. The problem was that means he would have to give up some of the French sovereignty to these multilateral organizations. And his concern was that the other European states, at best, would only give up a modicum of sovereignty. And therefore, you'd have mixed sovereignty, where you have this multilateral organization, whether it be NATO or the EU, what we now know as the EU, and that it couldn't work in a time of crisis because as long as those European leaders are still beholden to their nation's electorate, the individual electorates of each nation, they would do what was in their nation's best interests. And the minute you had one European state start cleaving away from the herd, they would all start trying to make deals, whether it was in the face of a Soviet invasion or or an economic crisis. And so he worried about the mixed sovereignty issue. And this has been a key concern that has dominated many French leaders, even as they have ceded more sovereignty over the last 30 years. At the same time, de Gaulle recognized, this is a great quote from him, that France alone could not hope to match the global superpowers. There's no way. And this was the logic behind enmeshing himself or France in some of these multilateral agreements, but obviously not becoming too involved in them where he would have to cede sovereignty. The thing about France's position in Europe is that during the Cold War, it always had to balance its desires against the fact that there was this hulking Soviet force right over the horizon. After the end of the Cold War, the Soviet threat went away, and the French and the Germans as well, understandably said, well, it's a new market. Let's try to do business. Let's try to make more diplomatic, arrangements, amicable arrangements with the Russians now that the Soviets are gone, the communists are dead. Or communism is dead, rather, kind of. So they focused, instead of trying to worry about the kind of more traditional military side of the geopolitical balance, they looked at the economic. They thought that, well, we're still a premier economy, so we can dominate Europe. Germany, after reunification, they still were not they were still not anything to compete with France, which was united and it was modern, and they didn't have the history of being divided the way the Germans did during the Cold War. Of course, that assumption would, as you know, not prove out. But at the time, it made sense for French leaders in the 90s, like Chirac and Sarkozy into the 2000s, to start willingly cede more and more sovereignty away, because they figured if it's an economic union that we're going to build, well, that's fine, because we are a dominant economic power and we also have a large military force, so we'll be able to be the first among equals on the continent in any new any new European integration, which ended up being the European Union. The Germans, of course, were fine with this. They went along with it. It was very much a Franco-German initiative. The Treaty of Maastricht was driven through largely by French and German interests. And this gets us into another issue of Atlanticism. And there's a big question mark over the recent elected president of France, Emmanuel Macron, because in the media we keep hearing that, well, he's a centrist and he's an Atlanticist, which means that he favors increased integration between Western Europe and the U.S., and particularly he supports NATO. That's true to a point, but the Holzman quote I alluded to earlier seemed to, in 2003, maybe this was because it was 2003 and the height of the going into Iraq was still there. Holzman seemed to suggest that there was a very stark divide in French politics between Gaullists and Atlanticists. And Gaullists favor more French independence, and they favor a more continental view, which they do. And the Atlanticists favor a greater orientation toward England and America and that kind of Anglo-Celtic American realm. I actually disagree. I think it's on a continuum, and I think that most French political leaders have elements of Gaullism within their policies, regardless of party politic. There is a strain of they worry about American unilateralism. There is a strain of French unilateralism. There is a strain of French. There's an independent streak that even as they're calling for greater unity, they're going to do so as long as they think, which is totally sensible, as long as they think that it's in their interests. And so I think that if they have to buck America a few times, they gladly will. If they have to side with America, they gladly will. I don't know if that is, I don't know if Holzman was correct when he, at least in my reading of his work, seemed to suggest that in France you're either an Atlanticist or you're a Gaullist. That's simply not the case. It's a spectrum, it's a continuum. And there are hints of this French nationalist streak with members of the right as well as the left in France. This concept I spoke about 2 seconds ago about unilateralism, the fear of American unilateralism, it really became pronounced in the post-Cold War period under Jacques Chirac. His foreign minister, Hubert Védrine, I can never say his Védrine, I think he did a New York Times article in 1992, he did an interview in which he defined the term hyperpuissance, and forgive me if I'm butchering the pronunciation. And to you and I reading that, we would think, well, that's a fairly academic view, but it actually, it was a pejorative. It was not something, he was not looking at it fondly, and he was not just analyzing American power. To the French, particularly in the post-Cold War era, American unilateralism was the threat to their diplomacy, to their ability to project power. That American unilateralism was something to be overcome. And so the Chirac government in particular really took up this Gaullist notion of furthering an independent French power, and they wanted to begin advocating for, they began calling for the creation of a multipolar post-Cold War era in which America was a major power, but there were several others. And this, as you will see, became a common call from the Putin government and Russian nationalists in the post-Cold War era. It also was a call of the German left and some of the far-right elements in Germany of creating a multipolar world where, if not their individual country, a Franco-German-led Europe would be operating on an equal footing with the British, with the Americans, with the Russians and Chinese. There's a man, Primakov, the bottom picture, he was one of the architects of Russia's calls for multipolarity. He's basically the Russian Soviet, this Russian's Henry Kissinger. He was very much a grand strategic thinker, and he had a lot of influence. He was, of course, in the Soviet era, he was up and coming, but in the post-Soviet era, he was first very tight with Yeltsin, and then he became very close to Putin. And he was the one who recognized, after the American intervention, NATO intervention in the Balkans, that, first of all, as Russians, we don't like when NATO starts interfering in what we perceive to be our sphere of influence, which is the Balkans and the Eastern Europe, the former Soviet space. And the fact that the West didn't acknowledge our concerns over this issue, we need to use our soft power and diplomacy as an effective tool for stunting American and Western influence. And he called for the creation of diplomatic strategic triangles. Now for him, he was looking east, and he was saying Russia should align closely with India and China to balance America. But Putin took his concept of strategic triangles, and he actually applied it to Germany and France. And he saw in this Gaullist strain of thought, he saw a means to cleave France and Germany potentially away from America and Britain, and thereby neutering NATO, and if Putin could have his way, breaking apart the European Union. And the picture in the middle is very telling. This strategic triangle really came to shape, came to fruition, and was at its pinnacle of power under the leadership of Russian President Vladimir Putin as a silent partner, and then the more vocal Jacques Chirac of France, and then Chirac's good buddy and the man who would go on to become a senior executive with the oil industry in Germany, a good friend of Putin, Gerhard Schroeder of Germany. These three men were instrumental in, I'm not going to make a commentary on the Iraq War, I don't want to get into that here, but we cannot deny that this strategic triangle, in my view, did more damage to the American diplomatic standing in the world than any enemy could have, than Saddam ever could have, an actual enemy. These three forces aligned on the international stage and basically not only made opposition to Iraq specific to the Iraq War, but made it a referendum on American hegemony and America's ability to project global power. And that referendum, at least for Putin, continues to go on to this day. Obviously, Chirac and Schroeder are no longer in power, although it should be noted, in Germany, Schroeder, as I noted, is a senior oil and natural gas executive with deep ties to Gazprom and Putin. And in fact, I believe Putin, I might be wrong, I thought I read this recently, that Putin is actually one of Schroeder's children's godparents. I might be wrong, but they're so close. Back in the 2000s, they would routinely Christmas together. They would have their Christmas. So, and Schroeder is still influential, especially on the German left. And Chirac is still, Chirac is on the right, but Chirac's cronies are still very influential with the French business community, as well as on the French left. In fact, it was either the Sarkozy government or the Hollande government. One of the Minister of Defense was actually a former Chirac aide. It was a unity government that they had to do. It might have been Sarkozy, but these elements are still at play today. In my view, the Bush administration's decision. This is an unattributed quote, but it is rumored that in 2003, Condoleezza Rice, as National Security Advisor to George W. Bush, that she advised him to punish France, ignore Germany, and forgive Russia. I actually think that we probably should have forgiven France, ignored Germany and punished Russia, because obviously Russia today is still feeling its oats. So as I noted earlier, the French banked on being able to have outsized influence in European politics by really steamrolling the integration of a European supranational alliance, and they banked that they would have, because they figured they were the most dominant continental military power still, they figured they would have outsized influence, and of course in an economic union, or at least a predominantly economic union, such as the European Union, if you don't have the potent economy, the country with the most potent economy, in this case Germany, your old nemesis, will. And so this gets us into the Gaullist view of having a large centralization of power and having an outsized government role in the economy. For years, France has dealt with a very poorly performing economy. I think it's under 2% growth annually, GDP. And then if you look at this, without government expenditures, the French economic growth is even worse. GDP is even worse than it is today. The France of today has really fully embraced globalization, low trade barriers, open economy. These are things that you and I have been taught are very good, but if you were to ask anybody living in any of the cities listed, Tarbes, for instance, if it's good, I think they'd give you the same answer that the Americans living in the Rust Belt would give you, is that no, it's actually depleted us, that a handful of cosmopolitan centers are integrated into the global economy. It's a knowledge-based economy, but if you're not involved with it, as much of the country is not, you're going to have diminishing returns. This is why, by the way, Marine Le Pen went from having one department supporting her in 2012 to having, I think, 40% of the electorate of France supporting her. It's because it's the same reason. It's the working class. This was the number one concern. And I bring up the economy because it's important to know that French economics has left much to be desired, going back to at least the 1970s. But if you flash back to the interwar era, in between the two world wars, the French economy was sputtering even then. And this was one of the reasons why they were so desperate to try to build a balance of power against Germany. French economics has been abysmal for at least a century. They've had okay, I mean, they do okay. You're living in a westernized country, a modern country, but in terms of what you're taking home at the end of the day, your expenditures are very high. That's because of the outsized role of the central government. And you can just see it here. Higher unemployment than the average OECD country. GDP growth is in the tank. And more importantly, human capital. The human capital question, which has been dogging Western governments for decades, since the 1970s. We're having a baby bust, as Jonathan Last calls it. Not just in France, but in Europe, also in some parts of America, in Canada, in Japan. Westernized, modern countries are not having enough babies. And this is important because human capital, this, by the way, this is also a problem for Russia that they don't talk about very often, but a large part of Putin's foreign policy is predicated on cleaving as many ethnic Russians back into the fold so that they can start replenishing their losses in terms of demographics. As you see, like in France, like in Britain, and like in Southern Europe and parts of the West and parts of Europe, other parts of Europe, a persistent decline in fertility rates coupled with an increase in immigration from parts of the world that are not culturally Western is having a very unforeseen impact on French politics, on European politics, Russian politics, as well as their national security and geopolitical outlook. It's just another graph that GDP has been flat for France. And this is getting immigration. Just so you all know, demographers assert that it should be 2.1 minimum, 2.1 children per 1,000 women in each country to maintain what's known as societal replacement level. And that is the barest minimum number of people that you need born in every generation in order to maintain the country's political and cultural standing as you grew up in it, as you remember it. If you look, beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, if you start having consistently below average returns, and by the way, this uptick here is only because of the masses of immigrants that they've been taking on. If you start having a persistently low fertility rate, eventually it will have deleterious impacts, and it is, on your economy, on your growth projections, on everything. It will slow everything down. And the Europeans are kind of the poster children for what happens when you stop having enough babies. And France had went through this before, though. I was reading Paul Johnson's book last night, and I flagged Modern Times. He has a whole section on French demographics in the interwar era, and it mirrors what's going on now. They were, in the 1920s and 30s, started only having one child per family. They started to suffer economically for it. At the same time, they were facing threats arrayed against them. Back then it was Germany. Today it's potentially Russia. It's terrorism. There was a lot of issues, and it all goes back to demographics. Many commentators, Mark Stein, Walter, forgive me, I butcher his name, Lacour, I butcher his name. I've read his books on the subject, and one of the notable ones is The Last Days of Europe, and he has a whole part about French immigration policy and how initially after World War II, many European countries, France among them, started allowing for their former colonial subjects to come back and work as guest workers. The intention was they'd come, work for a few years, reinvigorate the ailing French economy, and then go back to their homelands, rehabilitate their homelands and whatever. And of course, if you're coming in from somewhere else and you're living in a Western country,
why do you go back?
Right, that's right, and exactly right. And they stayed, and then they started bringing family members over, and then some of those family members came over because they wanted the money, but they didn't like the Westerners. They didn't like the Western culture. And then eventually in the 80s, which is where you start to see the arrival, the kind of first wave of Islamists as political refugees, seeking a political asylum. And the more they came over, we assumed it was because they were freedom fighters. But in fact, in many cases, they were actually on the run from their home governments because they were actually illiberal, and they were seeking to, re-implement some form of Sharia or very radical politics back home. They weren't welcomed, understandably, but we welcomed them here. One of my favorite examples is, we forget, in the late 70s, his exile from Iran, the Shah of Iran, was to Paris. He was a big hit over there. And he tricked the Parisians, and many of these people tricked the French authorities into making them believe that, oh no, we're Democrats. And it's not true. And so the first seeds of what we're seeing today in terms of the Islamist ideology in Europe and France were sown here in the late 70s, early 80s, when the first wave of Islamists started seeking political asylum in places like France, permissive societies. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the works of, and I can never, again, it's another, I'm terrible with names, and I apologize, Christopher Galoui or Galoy. He's a pretty big deal realtor, a real estate developer in Paris, and he's also a geographer by training. And he has seen firsthand the demographic changes, particularly in northern Paris. And he wrote a book in France about these trends. And the top quote, "The young men living in the northern Paris suburbs feel a burning solidarity with their Muslim brethren in the Middle East." Very telling. And even though many of the jihadists that are conducting attacks in Europe are actually second-generation immigrants, meaning that their parents came over from wherever in the Middle East or Africa or wherever, and that they were actually either born or spent most of their lives living in the French system, they are, for whatever reason, having this negative reaction to French culture, French politics, and they're finding solidarity back home in their native homelands. And then, of course, couple that with what I was talking about earlier, the old French middle class had been declared surplus to requirements because the work they used to do is outsourced. These are the trends internally driving French politics today. And just to give you a little data here from Vox, so it's not it's not a Trump-loving website I found. I purposely looked for a very left-leaning website to show that the increasing share among the French society who share a favorable view of ISIS. It's pretty scary. 16% may not sound like a lot to you and I, but I would think 1% is pretty scary. I imported this from Pew. It's an interesting thing that the Muslims in these European countries, particularly France, are younger than Europeans, the French in this case, and they are having more children than the native French population. Again, not in and of itself a bad thing, but given the prevalence of jihadist ideology that is cropping up and the fact that the French government is unable to properly integrate these folks into the larger French national culture, it's a problem. However, for those who are worried about hate crimes, which seems to be anytime there's an attack in France or in Britain or in Western Europe, the media starts going, well, we don't want to have backlash. And we don't want to have backlash against anybody who's innocent. But look at how the lowest, those who have a negative view of Muslims, they're not many in France or Germany or the UK. It's always in the Eastern countries, and they're the ones with the stricter immigration policies, and they're the ones who are not suffering through the jihadist wave. They don't have to worry about Russia next door, which is a big worry. More on the economy there. You look at the Bloomberg. I thought Bloomberg had some great coverage of the French election in terms of what they were charting and what they were looking at. And I'm normally a skeptic of Western media, but this to me, the divide between the educated, the people who were formally educated who voted for Macron, and those who were in the blue-collar communities that were dying voting for Le Pen, it's pretty stark. It's the countryside. Angelo Codevilla refers to it as the ruling class versus the country class. The country class lost in France, but there's a clear correlation. And Ian Bremmer posted something I thought was funny after the election. Macron 2017, Le Pen 2022. Is that the big fear? I actually think it's the wrong fear. Le Pen, yes, her share of voters is increasing, but they're also older, and they're also people who are, with all due respect, going to probably die out before, they're going to see a decline in their number. The young people of France are all generally to the left, and they are living in the cities, and they voted for Macron, but there was a huge uptick. I think the real fear in both Germany and France should be among left-wing populists. And in this case, if you look at Mélenchon's numbers, as Marine Le Pen and Macron were all declining toward the end of the first round of voting, Mélenchon's numbers exploded. And he, since the youth in French society, and since most of the youth tend to be aggregated into the cities, and they've grown up in this knowledge-based, or as my friend Chris Buskard calls it, the plantation economy, knowledge-based economy. I think that he actually, or people of his ilk, and by the way, Mélenchon is in the back pocket of the Russians, as is most of the French left. I think that people of his ilk in future elections will stand a much greater chance of winning. And the reason is simple. We have to harken back to the reason I brought up in the beginning, French independence and the French mixed sovereignty crisis that's been going on, is because Macron is very much a fan of Merkel, is a fan of Atlanticist rhetoric. He's a fan of the EU, definitely a fan of NATO. However, he is very much the junior partner to Merkel. There's no doubt. And The Merkel government has been insistent, and Macron has agreed in principle to this, that the French need to get their financial house in order. France is a weight around Germany's economic neck, and Germany has been carrying them. The French, one of the reasons there's such a backlash to immigrants is because the French have become wholly dependent on the welfare state in France. And the welfare state and the poor economics is the result of this increased Keynesian or statist interference in the French private sector. And to be fair, Merkel called for private sector reforms as well, but coming from the Germans, who have also a very higher than usual, at least from an American perspective, government interference in their private sector. I don't know if that's like the pot calling the kettle black. The French electorate, if Macron is serious about implementing these reforms, he will not make it electorally, because the moment you start going after people's livelihoods, the way that they live their lives, economics, they're not going to vote for you. And in fact, one of the reasons that Marine Le Pen was so successful, and Donald Trump to a lesser extent was like this as well, was because they made a bargain with the people. We won't go after the welfare state. We may talk about tweaking it here and there, but we're going to talk about defending your entitlements. That was very strong. That was a strong pull for many people, especially in those depressed blue-collar communities. It also won Le Pen a little bit of left-wing support. Mélenchon and his leftists, the socialists, they are all in favor of not only protecting the entitlement system, but in also maintaining French sovereignty and independence away from Germany, away from the EU. So they're Eurosceptical as well, which in another life wouldn't have been that good, but in the last 20 years, as these trends have worked in France's disfavor, people are starting to wake up to the fact that they don't like the EU, or at least they don't like it as it's arranged. And so French sovereignty and French, that independent streak, is going to start playing in unexpected ways, to say the least. And this whole lecture, everybody keeps talking about, and I kept talking about, well, if Macron loses, then the future of Europe, that's up for grabs. No. Whatever France does doesn't matter for Europe. All that matters is what happens in Germany. That's all that matters. If you understand what's going on in Germany, you'll understand, will the EU be around a little bit longer? What will NATO's role be? This is kind of the sine qua non for European politics, is the German pivot. Everything circles right now around the German, especially now that Brexit happened, everything circles around the German pivot. Understand that and you'll understand pretty much everything that's going on with European integration and all that stuff. So serious change is coming. That is, we're already living through it. But the question of what is France's role in this budding German-Russian alliance, and by the way, I'm hoping to do another lecture focusing on Germany, but for this lecture, because it was about France, I really didn't get too much into it. But France's role, and they are waking up to this fact, once they realize that they are not equals at that table with Russia and Germany, once they realize that, sure, they have the military still, Russia still wants to do military deals with them, and they still want to do business with them, but the prize is Germany for Russia. They want Germany, they want them in their back pocket, they want them to be buddy-buddy, they're trying to build this strategic alliance. France would be an added benefit, but once the French, regardless of whether it's Le Pen on the right or Mélenchon, because I think Macron's political fortunes, I think his days, I'm very skeptical of his longevity. I realize that puts me as an outlier, but I'm happy to be that. Once the French wake up to the fact that they are not equals here, this budding alliance will not last long, in much the same way that previous French alliances with Russia or with Germany have not lasted. For the French, it's economics, it's this independent streak, but also there is a deep-seated allergy toward German power. And Germany, obviously militarily, although they are talking about heading an EU defense force, Germany militarily is nothing without the rest of the West, particularly the U.S. But economically, oh yeah. Here's my contact info. I have my own website, WeichertReport.com. I've written extensively on, I actually have an entire symposium I did on Russia, Germany, and France. I've just been, as of yesterday, was made a contributing editor for the new, it's a conservative publication, American Greatness, amgreatness.com. You should also check out the sister publication. It's an academic journal called American Affairs Journal. It's a quarterly journal. They're on their second edition. I'm hoping to submit something for their third edition in fall. You can follow me on Twitter at Brandon Weichert. Follow me on Facebook at the Weichert Report. And check out our YouTube page. I occasionally do video blogs. I really don't enjoy it. I post these talks and interviews. I'm interviewed a lot. So if there's this is Q&A, so I know I went a little long. So please feel free to ask. Yes, sir.
My question goes to a point of detail early on in your lecture. You mentioned that France's alliance with Russia lasted until 1912. Why 1912? Beginning of the Balkan War, or?
Well, if I remember correctly, I think the treaty lapsed. I actually don't remember that. When I was reading, because I was trying to confirm the dates, because I was getting conflicting dates. That's the last piece I read, because some of them said that it started in the 1880s. The official treaty, though, I know it began in 1890, and I believe 1912, I don't actually remember why it ended in 1912, but the Bolshevik Revolution pretty much ended Russia's usefulness anyway, so it was until World War I, basically, that whole order ended. But in regards to French-Russia connections, particularly with Chirac, and even with Sarkozy, the Russian influence is still there, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, they re-engaged in a Franco-Russian alliance. The demographic and economic realities of Russia, I think, lend itself to the notion that the same thing that happened before with the Franco-Russian alliance will play out again, whether it's 10 years from now or 20 years from now, in that the centrifugal forces within Russia make a partnership with Russia temporary at best and fleeting. Is that whether it's demographics with the Muslim community in Russia, whether it's demographically in terms of there's potential that there's mass protests going on right now in Russia's east, could bleed into the west. That's why they've created this new Russian National Guard under Zolotov's command, who's a Putin apparatchik. There is real fear in Russia that the winds of change are blowing again. And this time, if the winds of change blow too hard, unlike after the Bolshevik Revolution and unlike after the Cold War, I disbelieve that Russia will remain an intact state, that you'll have the oblasts separating, which is problematic for our foreign policy, to say the least, given all the nukes. But so any alliance with Russia from France's perspective is frankly idiotic. It's temporary at best. So, yes, sir.
Throughout the course of the 2016 election, then candidate Trump, he received a lot of questions about just what his plans were if he were to be elected.
Sure.
And there were a lot of questions after he got elected regarding, okay, well, where's this healthcare plan that you said you had?
Right.
And come to find out, there was none. And where's your strategy with Syria? Come to find out, he had none. But what we are learning is that the basic underlying principle that President Trump is going to move forward in his presidency with is to go line by line, just Google, and say everything that President Obama did from 2008 up until when he left office, and do the exact opposite. Just go down the line, okay, I'm going to do the opposite of this. I'm going to do the opposite of what we did in Cuba. Do the opposite of what he did with the Paris Climate Agreement, although I don't know the history of any of these nations.
Sure.
Or the actual acts itself. We're going to do the opposite, and it's just going to make it seem like all my voters, that I'm doing what I said I'm doing.
I actually disagree with you on that. I actually think that, I mean, I don't want to talk domestic politics here. It's not what this is about. But I will say, just put this in your ear, 62% of the National Security Council staff are Obama holdovers. Most of the people in the mid-levels of our government are still Obama holdovers, and the ones that are Republican belong to the group known as the Never Trump Republicans. So, and if you look at what he's done, I don't want to even talk about health care because that's not what this is for. No, I understand. I know. The Paris Climate Agreement, I don't know if it's just doing the opposite of what Obama did. I think it was looking at the economics and saying that this is at a tough economic time for America, regardless of whatever's going on with the environmental science community. The economics of the situation are that hemming us in economically is not going to help us. It's not going to help the Europeans. It's not. In fact, the French business community and I said this in my first talk. I think you were at that as well. The French and German business communities are screaming bloody murder because the U.S.-backed sanctions on Russia are preventing their industries from doing the kind of trade they want with Russia. So I actually think that it's not just a question of doing the opposite of his predecessor. I think President Trump, his people did look at the economics, which tends to be, given his business background, a serious component of the Trump agenda, such as it is. Now, we can talk offline about how effective it's been, and I think that part of the problem, I don't think it's actually been I don't think he's actually done I think doing the opposite would have made more sense. I think keeping a lot of these Obama holdovers and a lot of the Never Trump Republicans in place has actually nullified the administration's ability to affect the kind of change that it promised the Trump voters. The fact that the Trump voters are still 92% behind Trump, I think that's more to do with the fact that they're giving him a chance. It's only been 5 months. Okay, we'll see. I don't think he's doing the exact. I think it would be easier if he just did the exact opposite of his predecessor, to be honest with you, politically. But in terms of the climate change agreement, it's about economics. It really is. And in fact, actually, I'd like to amend something I did just say. The Europeans, the reason they're so wedded to it is because select industries in the newfangled green economy, a lot of them are based in Europe, based in France. They benefit a lot. So I don't know how much of it is a commitment to saving the earth or buying into the science, and how much of it is just, first of all, we benefit economically, partly from it. I think they would benefit more if they just, were with us on this in the long run. And then also it's a question of that old French independence streak and trying to stick it to America because, well, we don't like American hegemony. And to the French, going back to the American Revolution, they viewed us and always have as rustics. So, it's a cultural thing as well, more so I think than scientific. But there's no doubt that there are French leaders who believe the science, and that's fine. But it is economics for us, and also to a point for the French. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Sure, yeah.
Do you see the Berlin-Moscow axis on the German side, on the Berlin side, as primarily socialists like Gerhard Schroeder and his link with Gazprom? Or are there German Christian Democrats who also are part of this axis?
Oh, well, I wanted to bring the book with me. There's an incredible book out. It's called Putin's Propaganda Machine. And it's by Marcel, I forget his last name now. He's in France. I believe he's actually with Brookings. I think he's actually with Brookings. But he's over there right now. And he wrote this incredible book, Putin's Propaganda Machine. He has a whole chapter on just that question in which he tracked the economic ties between the Putin regime and the leaders of both the left and right in France and Germany. And you find that Putin has, it's economics, Putin has bought out support from both sides of the aisle in both France and Germany. Obviously we heard a lot about Marine Le Pen, or now we hear which is collapsing, the Alternative for Deutschland party, the alternate right-wing party in Germany, you heard a lot about their flirtations with Russia. And it's true, there are a lot of connections there. That's also for the AfD cultural, though, because they're mostly based in what was once East Germany, so it makes sense that they would have a bit of sympathy for the Russians. It's economics, though, because obviously the oil and natural gas is so prevalent for both countries from Russia that is a strategic lever that Putin has no problem playing. Also, both countries do not want to see a revitalization. Well, people like Schroeder and his cabal in Germany, and people like the Chiracs on the right, and then also to an extent some of the left, like Mélenchon in France, they don't want to see a total revival of pro-American sentiment and a total revival of the American military presence in Western Europe. They don't want to see it, they don't like it, and they certainly don't want us, in their view, to agitate for another war, a Cold War with Russia, in which Germany and France are, in their view, on the front lines, even though really it's Eastern Europe that's unfortunately being targeted. But it's all, So, your question though about it is cultural. It is also the fear of war being visited upon the homelands of Germany and France, and it is economic. It is a lot about the oil and gas. Look at, and in terms of the Christian Democratic in Germany. Yeah, there are definitely elements that are friendly toward. There's this myth, and it's been perpetrated by the American, in particular, the American media, that the Western Europeans in particular are, the Merkels and with Hollands were staunchly anti-Russian. Not true. Not true. Merkel, yes, her background as living in Eastern Germany and experiencing that. Yes, no, she's not a fan of Russia, but she has no problem doing business and with the Russians. And I am skeptical, given what's going on with the contentious upcoming elections in Germany. I am skeptical that she's going to maintain those sanctions, particularly in the face of renewed pressure from Putin. I'm very skeptical. And furthermore, I'm actually more worried about Germany's potential partnership with Russia than I am France. France is the independent streak. So Germany, on the other hand, if you're an economic power, you want to take the path of least resistance. You're closer to Russia. That's a big market, relatively untapped. You get most of your natural gas, and they're trying. And Merkel's a mixed bag because she's trying to diversify. She's trying to still stay oriented toward the Atlanticists, but I just don't know if geography is maybe destiny in this case. I don't know. We'll see. But there are definitely pro-Russian elements even within the CDU in Germany. So. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the rise of the jihadists in Europe.
Sure.
And in the 70s there were no jihadists.
Yep.
And all of a sudden we have jihadists.
Yeah.
Now the question is, you didn't mention anything about U.S. foreign policy on the rise of the jihadists. So we bear the
right, and so
responsibility of the rise of the jihadists.
Just to clarify, are you speaking just generally in our foreign policy toward the Middle East, or are you speaking?
Starting with Afghanistan.
Sure.
During the Soviets.
Yeah.
Right? I remember President Reagan brought this mujahideen to the White House. He paraded them in front of people, saying these are the freedom fighters.
Sure.
And then they end up fighting.
Well, you got to remember. The thing about Afghanistan you have to remember is that the mujahideen, it became co-opted by the foreign fighters from Saudi Arabia predominantly, but initially they were actually Afghans. They were militant Islamists, no doubt, but they were actually Afghans fighting for freedom. And so I actually believe the group in that picture were actually not who would go on to become Al Qaeda. But there's no. You're right. Yeah, our foreign policy has been short-sighted. I just gave an interview with Chris Buskirk on the Seth Chris Show, which is it's a talk show out of Arizona. It's West Coast based, and he was actually talking to me about this, and I was saying that what we really need to try, and my last talk at IWP was about this as well, we've got to try to, it looks like we might be, try to get back to some semblance of a balance of power arrangement in the Middle East to create stability, which, by the way, will create stability in terms of the refugee flows, because many of these people are coming into Europe because their homes are getting blown up. So, I mean, I can't, the jihadist threat, it's a scourge. It has to be crushed. But part of me, I do feel for a lot of these people coming over, because a lot of cases, the BBC had me on about this back in February, and I got into it with one of the guests. a lot of the problem is when these refugees, they flee their homes in Syria, for instance. They go to a UN refugee camp. The UN has a lottery system, basically, the High Commission on Human Rights, and they say, okay, well, do you want to stay in the refugee camp? Who wants to stay in a refugee camp? He said, or do you want to, put your name in a lotto to go to one of these countries that's accepting X amount of refugees? A lot of times they end up in France, in Germany, or Canada, because those are the countries that are taking in the most. But when you're raised in a very militant and very strict Muslim community, and you come to Paris and you see these Parisian women, now they're beautiful, but they don't look, they don't dress, they don't act the way that you're supposed to act in those cultures, and then you start to miss home. And then you, furthermore, in France, they're not very good at integrating these people to work, have sustainable work, because there's the fear that they're going to take my job. Or there's the fear that they're going to go on the welfare system, they're going to start, making my benefits even less than they already are. And so then you have this integration problem. So you have this terrible toxic brew in France and throughout Europe and Canada now even as well. U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, it's been a little short-sighted. It's not all. It's not all our fault though.
We're still allied with Saudi Arabia, which are.
We have to be though. It's
No, we
unfortunate.
don't have to be. We can force them to change their
We-
conduct.
Yeah.
Because in the schools in Saudi
No, I
Arabia,
know.
the Wahhabism.
No, I know. And in Pakistan as well. I know.
They are nurturing the
Yeah.
Wahhabism.
Well,
in schools,
that
and
is
yet we don't say anything about it.
that was a deal. That was a deal with the devil that the House of Saud made, because in the 70s it was the Mecca siege. They were awoken to the fact that, oh my gosh, there's a large portion of our population who hates us because we're aligned with the West. But we actually like going to school in America, and we actually like the West. And so they had to do a deal, basically, the King Abdullah did a deal, basically, where we will look the other way on your activities as long as you don't bring it to Saudi Arabia. So you can export, and you can do, and it was a deal with the devil, and shame on them. But I understand why they did it, and we're caught in this position, and the West as well, all of the West, where we now run the risk, if we push Saudi Arabia way too far, they will either, the House of Saud will either, and same thing in Pakistan, the government there will either collapse and be replaced by jihadists, outright Wahhabists, or we try to contain the behavior. And I actually think, so far, the greatest achievement of the new administration, if they can actually keep on the Saudis, I don't know if they can, was to open the door to letting Saudi Arabia kind of run the gamut on the Sunni side of the Middle East. That's going to be the new balance of power. Sunni kingdoms with Israel against Iran, Shiite Iran. That's how we're going to keep the balance there. Before we could do it without having to rely on the religious factor, unfortunately, after Iraq 2003, that option is no longer there. So yeah, I don't know, our foreign policy in the Middle East is a disaster, but the Middle East itself is a disaster. So, I don't know how we...
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Sunnis are also not in favor of Wahhabis.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Sunni Muslims are not in favor of Wahhabis.
No, I know that.
But the Wahhabis are considered Sunni, but Sunnis do not like Wahhabis.
No, I know, and actually,
That-
actually, this is a good point you bring up. I'm actually working on a paper on this, and I'll just talk about it here, whatever. If you look at the Wahhabi uprising that happened in the 17th century, it was the Muslims who put them down. It was, initially, the Wahhabis had, what they were saying, they had a degree of sympathy from people. But as soon as they started going into villages and killing all of the Muslims that they viewed as unbelievers, the Muslims in the Arabian Peninsula and throughout the Ottoman Empire were going, we got to get rid of these guys. And so the Sultanate in what we now know as Turkey today, yes, they coordinated with the Egyptians and they crushed the Wahhabis. And there was not an utterance of Wahhabism until the Cold War era. And so you're absolutely correct. There is a distinction there. And I think that, so my article that I'm writing is actually predicated on, I think this deal with Saudi Arabia is hopefully the first step to generating the kind of reaction on the part of the majority Sunnis that they actually crush this Wahhabist strain.
And they were then backed by Brits, by the way.
Yes. Yes.
All has to be against Ottomans.
Right.
They were backed by Brits.
Yeah.
Right. It's true. And I don't want to make this obviously about the Middle East, but they are connected, and everybody forgets how connected they are to the issue in Europe. But we are all the unfortunate recipients of the toxic inheritance of British, French, and colonial foreign policy in that part of the world. And so, since America is not a colonial power, we have done the best we can to square an impossible circle. So I think we are starting to wake up to the fact that things are not tenable the way they are. And for the French, the French keep wanting to interfere in, they were the ones who were gung-ho for Libya. They were the ones who were gung-ho for Syria in 2013. They actually had French fighters orbiting Damascus ready to strike when Obama said, I'm out. Because I think Obama looked at and realized that it was going to be American GIs having to secure Damascus, because the French and the British would not have done maybe the British, but definitely not the French.
But we went along with Libya, right?
Foolishly.
Yeah.
Foolishly. No. And actually, to the point about Trump, this is actually, I think, why Trump on foreign policy has so much support from the American people, not necessarily the DC establishment, because he's saying, look, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, we're doing these ridiculous wars of liberation, sounds like a Marxist term, and what are we getting out of it? We're spending all this money, our young guys and gals are going over there getting killed, beheaded, and they hate us even more, and we're not liberating them. It's leading to the Islamist winter, which,
But we're now participating, with Trump participating in the war in Yemen, he's participating in the war in
well,
Syria.
we're back in the Saudis.
Yeah, well.
We have to remember that we right.
And participating in the war against the Syrian government, who, when he was a candidate, Trump, he said, why we should be allied with Syrian government to fight the Jihadis.
So I've done
Now
interview.
he's
So let me
fighting.
just tell you, in terms of he inherited a mess from his predecessor, and in terms of the Syrian missile strikes against the air base, that was in response to chemical weapons use, which is in no one's favor to encourage that kind of behavior. And if Assad had continued, and I know that there's dispute about who was responsible, but looking at the data,
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Candidate Trump, or before he became candidate, when Syria used the first time the chemicals,
I know.
he said that,
I know.
we should not use that against the Syrian
I know.
government. He was actually defending Syrian government.
Right, and JFK was very much opposed to landing on the moon when he was a senator, but he became rapidly.
Yeah, but
But it's the same thing, same logic. The view change. The view really does change.
my opinion is that he's not in charge of the Pentagon. Pentagon is doing what they want to do, and he's just signing off on that.
I hope that's the case in terms of Afghanistan.
Yeah, well,
in terms of Afghanistan.
He's totally doing things that he was.
No, I think. But to your point about the Syrian strikes, I don't think that deviates from what his stated foreign policy was. I think that those are exceptions to the rule. If you look at the airstrike, it was because he used chemical weapons, and we do not want to start a proliferation chain of chemical weapons, especially in that war. And then the second point, when he used force recently, was last week against the Syrian jet. It is not widely reported, but the reason that we had to act the way we did, we used the deconfliction line. We tried to warn the Russians. We tried to warn the Syrian government itself. They ignored us. We had special forces operators embedded with the Kurds who were fighting to retake ISIS positions. Those are our guys on the ground. So we went out of our way. In fact, when Trump became president, we reoriented the posture of our Air Force operating in Syria to give a wide berth to Russian and Syrian forces. And so I don't think that the airstrikes against Assad and the cruise missile strikes against Assad or the strike against the Syrian jets, I don't think that that's endemic of Trump losing control. I think that was the Trump administration saying, hey, look, we don't have a choice right now. Now that's a larger issue of should we even have guys there, but that's not what this was about. So you had a question, sir? Yes.
Yeah. All right. So back to the Paris Climate.
Yeah.
All right, let me try to stitch this together so I'm a little more clear.
Sure.
I'm curious to know, what do you think over the next 10 to 15 years in terms of political capital is concerned?
Mm-hmm.
When you have a situation where economically it does make sense. I know that you understand the economics of pulling out of the Paris Agreement because it really doesn't benefit the United States as a for-profit venture per se. But as far as just the average American seeing that type of headline on the news, and you look at the list of all the countries that were involved in that, And when President Trump's predecessor made the speech, announcing that agreement was made, he listed all of these countries, and it seemed like, wow, the whole world's coming together on this big climate change deal. And it gave the perception that, if everyone's doing this research on, new solar panels, different technologies, that those types of things would be shared amongst all of the world's countries. But at this point, now it's kind of seeming like, okay, we're out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It's more of a, U.S. isolationism, more like we're taking it's just us now. And just the message that it sends to the rest of the world on top of what's already
We were
happening.
the only ones who were on the hook. It was a bad deal. We were the only ones who were on the hook financially for contributing to the Paris Accords in terms of paying for what those regulations called for. France, Germany, China, India, $0. That was after the agreement. That's why they all signed on, because they thought we were idiots. And frankly, I did too for a period. If you want to talk about climate change, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'll just say that the ordinary Americans, people where I'm from, down in South, they are looking at declining profits just for getting by. And this deal increased made it much more difficult for them to just live. Okay? And this affects everybody. And so, if you want to do a deal, that's fine, but it needs to be equitable. I'm all for Reagan said, I'm all for building bridges, but the other side has to meet me in the midpoint. China's not going to do that. Anytime we try to get China to do anything with the environment, they freak out. The only times they do it is because they're nationalists. The only time they do it in terms of national interest, if it's in their national interest. So if they can hamstring us and empower themselves, they'll do it. They'll do it. They don't have any commitment to this sense of an international liberal world order. They don't care. The Russians don't either. And to be fair, I am increasingly skeptical that the French or Germans are either. It's all about national interest. We've all deluded ourselves into thinking that, well, there's this shared community. Now, Fareed Zakaria, I listened to him a few weeks ago, and he was all apoplectic because the administration defined the international order as being competitive. And he was going, what about cooperation? And I got to tell you, for an international relations scholar, I was pretty surprised that he was saying this, given the history. All geopolitics is competitive. We have areas of cooperation, but as Lord Palmerston said, a nation has no permanent friends or no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And that has never changed. That never changed. Why did the European countries support us in the Cold War? Well, because they had to, and also because they couldn't find an alternate way. De Gaulle, France was really actively looking for a third way, and he could never really do it. It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed that his successors could even entertain these notions of France seeking a multipolar world order. I don't mean to be flip, but Robert Kagan, the neocon, but he wrote, I thought it was hilarious, in 2003, a book called Of Politics and Power. I believe that was what it was called. But basically the thesis was that Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. And of course it's an old play on men are from Mars and women are from Venus. He was basically calling the Europeans, he was saying they were emasculated. And that the reason that they were so opposed to American foreign policy was less because they really disagreed with it. And by the way, when it comes to fighting terrorism specifically, there is no European political elite behind closed doors who's going to sit there and go, America shouldn't be doing this. It's only in public that they say this. But Kagan's argument was that the reason they're really opposed to American hegemony is because they used to have that kind of power in the colonial period, and they're envious. And I think that's a bit pop psychology, but it is funny to talk about. And I do think that the Rumsfeldian concept of old Europe versus new Europe, old Europe being the Western powers in Western Europe, and New Europe being the Eastern powers, I do think Rumsfeld was quite right about that. So it's in their interest to support the Paris climate change. It's nothing to do with the science. It's nothing, with very little. It's nothing to do with the sense of cooperation. They look at it as America's doing something stupid, and when your competitor starts doing stupid things, you get out of their way and let them. And so, you want to do a climate deal, fine. I don't want to see people in my neighborhood back home not being able to live even modestly, because taxes are going through the roof. You know, the ultimate goal here, I know, is the creation of a WTO-like organization called the World Environmental Organization, run at the international level. This was floated in 2008, 2007. It's never really gone away. There is this dream among the global elite that they will be able to create a what WTO does for trade, they will be able to do for the environment. And it's a way of coordinating global response at the international level to carbon pollution. Well, what you find is the people who are supporting this organization are all from the countries that are either, you know, ahead of the curve by investing and not seeing a return, by the way, ahead of the curve and investing on these green energy projects, or countries in the developing world, oddly enough, are saying that, yeah, we'll do it because it's going to increase regulations and it's going to hurt America's economic power. Not because it's all about national interest. And so if it was really about cooperation, fine, prove it. I want them to sit down and come up with something where everybody gives up something that they really need. For China, tell them to stop polluting. They literally will laugh in your face. So I don't believe in hurting America. And by the way, there's so much debate on the science. To say that it's a consensus clearly, you know, I don't think we should be crafting national policies that have long-running effects on our geopolitical position based on an issue that is still being debated. Because if you listen to Al Gore, we'd all be living underwater right now a decade ago. So you had a question, sir.
Yes, I was shifting back to the Moscow-Berlin Paris axis. What impact does that axis of those three powers have on the ongoing war in Ukraine, especially the Normandy Front negotiations?
Excellent. Yeah.
Does it turn those Normandy Front negotiations into a lurid kind of a charade?
Yeah. Yeah. So remember, what was the French and German reaction to Georgia? Now I know Georgia's not Ukraine, I know that, but what was the reaction? They beat their chest, how dare you? Putin picks up the phone. By the way, George W. Bush was redeploying from Iraq Georgian peacekeepers on US C-130s. We flew them right over the Russian lines in Georgia. Bush was daring the Russians to attack our Air Force because he was looking for a pretext to strike back because Georgia was our buddy. And the French and the Germans, they beat their chest. And then Putin picks up the phone and says, you know, it's getting cold in Europe this time of year, and you rely on our natural gas and oil. And if you don't get the Americans to stand down, we're going to start making your life hell. Now, whether he would have fulfilled that, who knows? But it was a threat. And what happened? Overnight, Germany floats the idea that, well, we need to rethink NATO expansion. Sarkozy, the newly elected, who campaigned, by the way, on a virulently anti-Russian program, very he wanted to undo all of Chirac. That book I told you about, Putin's Propaganda Machine, they have a whole section on Sarkozy. Literally overnight, his position changed. Within 6 months, him and Putin were bosom buddies. Medvedev and Putin and Sarkozy were the new buddies. And Sarkozy was the guy, the white knight that was supposed to ride in and save Georgia, and he ended up basically helping to turn Georgia into a rump state. There's now South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and there is no way that situation is going to be resolved. That is a snapshot for Ukraine's future if we're not careful. So I can't rely on Merkel to again, I don't want to be unfair to Merkel because she has done some good things, but we're not even talking about her immigration policy though. But she has done some good things regarding resisting Russia, and I think that's because of her personal antipathy toward Russia from her childhood. But you've got her political donors, the business community, all of them saying, we don't want these sanctions. You've got a huge following of Russia in Germany. There is a pro-Russia sentiment in Germany that dominates the voters there. It's over 60%. You have a favorable view of Russia. You've got all of her political opponents on both left and right, and even with someone within her own party, who are saying, we've got to change our policy toward Russia. So I don't know how reliable Germany will be in holding the line against Russian irredentism. France is another story. France, right now, they have this Atlanticist orientation. And the more that the French realize that Germany is going to be the dominant partner in any potential Russian-German-French alliance, the French will swing back toward the West. They will, especially the moment Germany starts really putting the squeeze on Macron to start reining in his entitlement programs, to start cutting off things, to start trying to save money. That's important to remember. France is going to always flirt. They're always going to flirt with the other lady, but they're always going to come back to us. That's just the way it goes. Particularly with the increasing instability of their jihadist problem. Putin, as a side note, I know I have people in Russia who read my website. I'd like to point out that Mr. Putin talks a big game about being the last bastion of Christianity. This is a lie. This is a lie. His problems with his Muslim community are as great as they are in Germany and France and Western Europe and Canada. He just hides it. His language that he speaks in is still the Marxist dialectic. I can't stress this enough. He is not the last Roman emperor or whatever, or the Byzantine. He's not what he says he is. He's using this because he knows it's an easy way into influencing particularly French and German politics, because there is a huge following for Putinism on the far right in Germany and the far left in Germany, and also on the far right in France and the far left in France, because of the fact that these are the most affected countries by the rise in jihadist violence. And so they're looking at, for instance, France, yes, is a Catholic country, but for decades their atheism was renowned. But now it's resurgent. The Catholic churches are being filled again. Ever since the 2014 or 2015 attacks, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. There's a huge sympathy and following for Putin because of this image that he perpetuates of himself as the last great Christian king. Wrong. In fact, during the election here in America, we kept hearing the term radical Islamic terrorism, radical jihadist terrorism, whatever. Putin was jumping on board in French, German, and English translations. He was jumping on board. Yes, we have to worry about these people in the Middle East, and we have to worry about these people in North Africa. But then, Paul Goebel, who's a professor here, his website, Window on Eurasia, he does Russian translations, as do I. I've actually never met him in person, but I know he's here, around here. But we both have translated speeches that Putin has made in Russian, in which, as early as this January, he was mocking Trump and mocking the American foreign policy establishment for even daring to, he said, those who conflate Islam with terrorism is wrong. Now, why did he say that? Because he knows he can look out the Kremlin window. They've got a big problem on their hand. And why do you think he's getting so buddy-buddy with the Iranians? He's trying to figure out a way to engage the Muslim world. He can't go to the Sunnis because they're our friends. The Saudis are our friends. So he's looking for. Look at Egypt. You know that there are posters of Egypt ever since that ridiculous revolution that should have never happened. But ever since Sisi took power, understandably, Sisi's looking at the Americans going, I don't know if I can trust you. In all of 2015, lining the streets of Cairo, there were giant posters of Putin. Oh, they loved him. Because he, in the international press, he's anti-jihad. No, he's not. No, he's not. He's turning the other. Kardyov, the guy in charge of Chechnya. He is a jihadist. He's putting gays into concentration camps. They are implementing Sharia law in Chechnya, and he is Putin's pick. He is buddies with Putin. Yeah. So this is not. This is a great.
But he's fighting the jihadists.
No, he's not.
The Chechens.
He blew up an apartment. He was not fighting. He was doing what he did. He was doing what he did in Chechnya because he was trying to stop them from separating. Putin's goal is the prevention of the dissolution of the Russian state. Putin could care less. He came up in the Marxist system. Putin is not a religious man. I don't care what anybody says. I know he's buddies with the head of the Orthodox Church, and he's got wonderful photo ops. He's a player. He knows what to do. He knows how to play people, and he realizes that and for him, it's not a lot like what Erdogan does in Turkey. For him to justify his reign, He has to hearken. He can't use communism, obviously, because even Putin said communism was a stupid thing in terms of the political side. He has to justify his regime's power and the excesses of his regime by calling on cultural symbols to Russians' past. So the Orthodox Church is a very recognizable thing. It's easy for him to latch onto. The reopening of the Cossack military schools for the young kids. These are things that are meant to, it's political. It's not cultural, it's political, more than anything. And so his deal in Chechnya, well, first of all, that was a way to signal to the cabal, and they are a cabal. Karen Dawish's book, Putin's Kleptocracy, details this very specifically. The group that tried to do the coup against Gorbachev in '92, that group of hardline KGB guys, after they got their clocks cleaned, they didn't go away. They looked at a new way to gain power and influence Russian policy, and that was by the economic side, aggregating as much economic power for themselves as possible in Russia. And then they began implementing that very hardline Russian view in politics. Putin, with his connections to the KGB, was their guy. Now, Putin is not the leader of this cabal. Putin is not he's a player in it, but look at guys like Primakov, who I talked about before. Look at guy who's dead now. But look at guys like Yazov, General Yazov. These are the old KGB, the red war dogs. They're the ones who are pulling the strings, and it's all politics to them. I'm sorry, Putin is. I know guys like Mark Stein always talk about how Putin's the last Christian warrior. Putin is not. He's using that symbolism to implement his power. Now, I still think there's coordination of interest between us and Russia. I think that's a possibility. I don't understand all of this Russophobic talk, because when you start denying Russia the ability to interact with us on the diplomatic and economic level, there's only one avenue left for them, because the Russians don't believe in slinking away. This is the nuclear. That's where you're going to start seeing, and the military, and the kinetic realm. And you're seeing that already. So there is a way we can, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but don't conflate Putin being politically savvy and wanting to retain power with him actually being this last cultural, Western cultural icon.
Now, Brandon, can I ask a question about that? Because a lot of my Russian friends are, he's made an alliance of convenience with the Orthodox Church.
Yes.
So that he can take on the guise of onward Christian soldier, and also restore the Orthodox Church to its pre-Soviet primacy. Mm-hmm. But your argument is that he's not really a committed believer, shall we say? He's
a committed believer in rehabilitating the Kremlin's influence over the Soviet space.
Oh, certainly the old Soviet recrudescence.
If anything, he has begun to flirt with this ideology known as Neo-Eurasianism, which calls for the creation of a Russian-dominated Eurasian economic union that spans Vladivostok to Lisbon. Alexander Dugin, my old friend Alexander Dugin, is he's kind of the intellectual godfather of this movement. And basically, it's supranational, like the EU, except Moscow runs it. And it's a Russian nationalist narrative in the sense that Dugin and Putin believes this as well. Russia's not just a country; it's a civilization state. Sits atop the world, spans 11 time zones, and it should dominate Eurasia. And it's based on the old Mackinder theories of the heartland and the global the world island, which Eurasia has the largest aggregation of natural resources and people. And as Mackinder used to say, whoever dominates Eurasia rules the world. And this is very much Putin's interest. Is he a true believer? He's a believer in, I think he believes he's the man tapped for great destiny. And so he must be in power. He left it to Medvedev, and Medvedev made a mess of things, so he had to come back. And so I think that he's a true believer in the sense of Russia being the strong man of Eurasia.
Well, I guarantee you.
Maybe I misunderstood the beginning of your question, but in terms of a true believer in ideology,
No, just in terms of his alliance of convenience
Yeah.
with the Orthodox Church.
it's totally a convenience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's-
You know what he did? Actually, getting back to France, what he did. There's there was an old cultural. I think it was an old museum. A famous one, was hideous in Paris. It's up the road from the Champs-Élysées. He bought this building, and he built the largest Orthodox Christian church in Western Europe. The kicker is, and French intelligence has confirmed this, it's also the largest FSB station. All of the priests coming out of this building are FSB agents, and they are being sent into Britain, into Canada, into America. He has annexed the leadership of the Orthodox Church. And it's an alliance of convenience. I think that Kirill is the head of the Orthodox Church. That's his buddy.
Yeah.
But it's very much, the Orthodox Church is very submissive to the Kremlin.
Yeah, there's no question.
It's an ally of convenience. And if the Orthodox Church ever got out of line, if Kirill ever misspoke, I think you'd be seeing a new head of the Orthodox Church. In fact, they're having an argument right now. I wrote an article on my website about this in February. One of the most sacred cathedrals in all of Orthodox Christendom is on Spruce Island off of Alaska's coast. And the head of the Orthodox Church determined last year that they still have a legal claim to that part of Alaska. That they never ceded sovereignty when we purchased it. And he's pushing Putin to basically lay claim to that part of Alaska. And Putin has been standoffish about it, but given the way that Putin is really desperately trying to pivot Russian foreign policy toward the Far East, and the fact that he likes tweaking America, and the fact that all of these intercepts have been going on against American planes in Alaska, and the fact that he's increased his holdings in the Arctic, maybe there's something, maybe we should be paying a little more attention to that. I could see something like that happening.
Well, there's a number of Russian Orthodox churches along the Alaska
Yeah,
coast.
but this one actually has sovereignty. It's
Yeah.
actually independent of America's, and they still hold it. And of course, the Kremlin holds control over the Orthodox Church. So, you had a question, though?
Yes. In the debate here in the United States, between engagers and skeptics, those who favor engagement with Russia, those
Right.
who think Russia will be useful in promoting American interests and values, versus skeptics who are against that, who don't trust Russia. The engagers argue that the ideas of Alexander Dugin, while they've become normative in the Kremlin, just as you said, are really opposed by influential members of the Russian diplomatic service.
Lavrov.
Right.
Yeah.
And how strong is that opposition to the project of Dugin?
So again, it's like the Orthodox Church, it's a matter of convenience. Putin uses Neo-Eurasianism as a unifying force when he needs to. And if you remember last year, he had a huge falling out with Dugin. Dugin was fired from his position at Moscow State University. Dugin was quite literally exiled. It was kind of funny. But he uses him when needed, and then whatever will expansion of power. So, it's not some spiritual longing the way that the Soviets had for communism, if you can even use spiritual with the word communism. But it's much more rooted in a more oddly parochial interest of Russian power and, returning the power of the czars, with Putin being the czar. So it's a pendulum. You're never going to be able to, this is, I think, one of the problems, I think, actually, you said something, this dichotomy that exists in D.C., and I've known it does because I go to these events and I hear, it's like, well, you're a skeptic of Russia or you're pro-engagement, and I'm actually a skeptic of Russia, but I'm also pro-engagement because they're kind of a big deal. You can't, ignoring the 300-pound elephant in the room is not the smartest move. In my first talk here at IWP a couple months ago, they were going to throw tomatoes at me, I thought, because I actually said that the French and German position is reasonable. Hey, let's loosen some of these sanctions and try to normalize the economic situation in Europe. My argument was, we should be focusing on strengthening Poland and the Baltic states militarily, and because that will deter Russia. The reason that, Angelo Codevilla at American Greatness in December wrote a fantastic essay about how the only reason Putin's doing what he's doing in Europe is because the doors have been left open. In the Baltic, in the Mediterranean, now the Arctic, the doors have been left open. And all we have to do for a very little amount is close those doors. So we maybe, I don't know, and on the extreme end, maybe give Poland a nuclear arsenal. Maybe start empowering the Baltic states to stand up. Because you'll find the Eastern Europeans are very much interested in resisting Russia. It's the Western Europeans, it's the French and the Germans who are going, So there's a way we can have our cake and eat it in this world, and that is, strengthen those parts of Europe that want to deter Russia, and allow for the business communities of Europe to still do business. Give the Russians an out. Sun Tzu always talked about when you have a surrounded enemy, the worst possible thing is to close off all avenues. Open one avenue that they can get through, that you maybe have a shot at. And remember, the budding protests in Russia today, it's not an accident that Putin created this new national security force. It's 400,000 troops strong. It's larger, I believe. It's the largest national security force they've had, and it's a National Guard, basically. Zolotov is commanding it. They are expecting really, really bad fallout because, if I were living under Putin, I'd be upset too. But I am skeptical, and what I said in my first and second talk here is American policymakers had better start figuring out a contingency plan for the next 20, 30 years when Russia collapses and you've got 12 or 13 new republics with nukes looking for ways to stay afloat. You think the Ottoman Empire dissolution was bad? You think the collapse of the Soviet Union was bad? Let me tell you something. We avoided a lot of the heartaches of what could have happened in the collapse of the Soviet Union because we still had a reliable partner in Moscow. Russia collapses now, it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be a bunch of new countries, bunch of new stands showing up, and they're not going to be easy to deal with. So, but I don't know. I hope does that answer your question? I hope I answered everybody's question. Oh, okay. So I think Kevin's pulling the crane here. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and it was an absolute pleasure talking to you all.